In this week's video, we're going to look at the relationship between growth momentum, the global economic cycle, and equity versus bonds in terms of relative performance. So we're going to start looking initially at the relationship between growth momentum and the global IP or industrial production cycle. So on the chart in front of us at the moment, we're showing in red our measure of growth momentum across the largest four regions, so US, Europe, Japan, and China. And the blue line represents the annual growth rate in industrial production. So essentially, on the left-hand scale, we've got the growth momentum series. You can see here where the cursor is, it's been below zero pretty much since the early part of 2018. And you can sort of see back in time where it's been below zero. You can also see that when it pushes above zero, that typically represents the inflection point in the IP or economic cycle. So it does seem to be important in as far as it tells you something about turning points in the cycle. How else can we use it? So what we're going to have a look at now is that measure of growth momentum, and what I'm doing here now on this chart, so G4 growth momentum, I'm identifying the regimes where it's been above zero, and you can see they've been shaded in blue going back to the early part of the 1990s. So that's the initial. Now, what we might be interested in is the performance of equities relative to bonds, and I'm going to look at that decision during periods where growth momentum is above zero. So let's just get that up here. That'll be on the left-hand scale, and we're going to split the axes. So on the top panel, we've got the performance of equities, this is global equities relative to bonds, and you can see those in the shaded periods. That is when momentum is above zero, and by and large, it's been good for equities, as one might expect. Only on one occasion during 2002, where we had a pickup in growth momentum, did equities actually underperform bonds quite significantly actually during that period. But on all other occasions, you can see here that periods of growth momentum being above zero have been associated with strong equity relative to bond performance. If we look at the other periods where growth momentum is below zero, they're now in red, and they're in the white sections. So the periods where momentum is below zero, you can see here that by and large been poor periods for equities relative to bonds. So it does seem on the surface a very good indicator to have in the toolkit when considering the equity versus bond decision. We can also look at other decisions that might be relevant to investors. Small caps, I'm going to look at, say, global small caps. We'll choose periods where momentum is above zero. So here you can see that small caps, that's equities versus bonds. I'm getting global small caps here, MSCI, there we go. So now we're looking at the dark blue line is global equities, small caps versus large cap. And you can see there, by and large, it's also been a period of outperformance in those periods. If we then consider periods where growth momentum is below zero, we can see here small caps, not so much in the early part of the 2000s, but certainly since then, generally declining growth momentum has been associated with poorer performance from small caps, and that's the phase that we find ourselves in at the present time. Growth momentum is and has been below zero for a good part of about 16 months. Other decisions that might be relevant, we'll look at the performance of defensives versus cyclicals. And again, here you would expect to see cyclicals outperforming. And that's the blue, so they're the blue lines, cyclicals performance. And if we put in now defensives is the red. So on all occasions, really except the 2013-14 period of rising growth momentum have cyclicals outperformed, and that's no real surprise. But what about some of the other factors? If we look at, say, momentum, that's the performance of the MSCI Momentum Index, strong performance. And if we compare that to, say, quality, By and large, the blue, which is momentum, has done better than the quality index, although not on all occasions, as you can see going back through here. Another decision of relevance might be minimum volatility. You can see there that's the performance during periods where growth momentum is above zero. And if we compare that to dividend yield, for example, you can see there that dividend yield as a factor has outperformed more often than not the minimum volatility factor. So the keeping an eye on what is happening with growth momentum does seem to be important, certainly for the equity versus bond decision, to some extent the smalls versus large, and then also at a factor level. We can then also look at this decision using our back tester, which I'll get to shortly. So now we're going to have a look at using this as an actual strategy, and going to have a look at some results using this strategy. And the portfolio that was set up is essentially 70% in global equities hedged back to Aussie dollars and 30% hedged back into the Citi World Government Bond Index. So a 70-30 portfolio. We allow it to drift 2% away from the benchmark. We also apply a trading cost. And the rules for the strategy are essentially when growth momentum is above zero, we go to 90% in equities, 10% in bonds, and when growth momentum is below zero, we go to 50% equities, 50% bonds. And so when we run the performance of that particular strategy, what we find, just make a change here. So provided here, you'll see some of the output, the annualized return from the strategy, 8.94% versus the benchmark return of 8.1, 1.78 trades a year with a Sharpe ratio of 0.43. You can see the drawdown statistics there, and the chart showing on the screen is the relative performance of the strategy versus the benchmark. So as you can see there, by and large, periods of fairly strong performance followed by flat periods. The exception, of course, is in 2002, 2003, where the strategy didn't work. And we saw that earlier on looking at the charts where, despite rising growth momentum, equity markets underperformed bonds quite significantly during that period. Thank you.